Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop c1 to g5. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop g5 takes e7. Queen d8 takes e7. Knight c3 to b5. Knight d7 to b6. Pawn c2 to c3. Pawn a7 to a6. Knight b5 to a3. Pawn c7 to c5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Pawn d4 takes c5. Knight b6 to d7. Pawn b2 to b4. Knight d7 takes e5. Knight f3 takes e5. Knight c6 takes e5. Queen d1 to d4. Queen e7 to g5. Pawn h2 to h4. Queen g5 to f5. Bishop f1 to e2. Castle kingside. Castle kingside. Knight e5 to c6. Queen d4 to d2. Queen f5 to e4. Pawn h4 to h5. Pawn d5 to d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Rook f8 to d8. Pawn h5 to h6. Pawn g7 takes h6. Bishop e2 to h5. Rook d8 takes d4. Queen d2 takes h6. Queen e4 to f4. Queen h6 takes f4. Rook d4 takes f4. Knight a3 to c2. Knight c6 takes b4. Knight c2 takes b4. Rook f4 takes b4. Bishop h5 to f3. Rook b4 to b2. Rook f1 to d1. King g8 to f8. Rook a1 to b1. Rook b2 to c2. Rook d1 to c1. Rook c2 takes c1, check. Rook b1 takes c1. King f8 to g7. Rook c1 to d1. Pawn h7 to h5. Rook d1 to d8. King g7 to f6. Bishop f3 to d1. King f6 to e7. Rook d8 to g8. Pawn f7 to f5. Bishop d1 to a4. Pawn e6 to e5. Rook g8 to e8, check. King e7 to f6. Pawn a2 to a3. Pawn h5 to h4. King g1 to h2. Pawn f5 to f4. Pawn f2 to f3. Rook a8 to b8. Bishop a4 to d7. Bishop c8 takes d7. Rook e8 takes b8. Bishop d7 to c6. King h2 to h3. Pawn e5 to e4. Pawn f3 takes e4. Bishop c6 takes e4. Rook b8 to g8. Bishop e4 to d5. Rook g8 to h8. King f6 to g5. Rook h8 to e8. King g5 to f5. Rook e8 to e2. Bishop d5 to c4. Rook e2 to d2. Bishop c4 to b5. King h3 takes h4. Bishop b5 to c6. King h4 to h3. King f5 to g5. Rook d2 to d8. King g5 to f5. Rook d8 to d2. King f5 to g5. Rook d2 to d8. King g5 to f5. Rook d8 to f8, check. King f5 to e5. King h3 to g4. Bishop c6 takes g2. Rook f8 takes f4. Bishop g2 to c6. Rook f4 to c4. King e5 to d5. Rook c4 to c1. Bishop c6 to b5. King g4 to f4. King d5 to d4. Rook c1 to c2. Bishop b5 to c4. Rook c2 to b2. Bishop c4 to b5. Rook b2 to c2. Bishop b5 to c6. Rook c2 to c1. Bishop c6 to b5. King f4 to f5. Bishop b5 to c4. Rook c1 to d1, check. King d4 takes c5. King f5 to e5. Pawn b7 to b6. Rook d1 to d2. Pawn a6 to a5. Rook d2 to d8. Bishop c4 to b3. Rook d8 to h8. Bishop b3 to d5. Rook h8 to d8. Bishop d5 to c6. Rook d8 to d1. Pawn b6 to b5. Rook d1 to c1, check. King c5 to b6. King e5 to d6. Bishop c6 to b7. Rook c1 to g1. Pawn b5 to b4. Rook g1 to g3. King b6 to b5. King d6 to c7. Bishop b7 to e4. King c7 to d6. King b5 to c4. King d6 to e5. Bishop e4 to d3. Pawn a3 takes b4. Pawn a5 takes b4. Rook g3 to g7. Pawn b4 to b3. Rook g7 to b7. Pawn b3 to b2. Rook b7 takes b2. Bishop d3 to g6. Rook b2 to a2. King c4 to c3. Rook a2 to g2. Bishop g6 to h5. King e5 to e4. Bishop h5 to e8. King e4 to d5. Bishop e8 to f7, check. King d5 to e4. Bishop f7 to e8. Rook g2 to g1. Bishop e8 to c6, check. King e4 to e5. Bishop c6 to b7. Rook g1 to f1. King c3 to d3. Rook f1 to e1. King d3 to c3. Rook e1 to d1. King c3 to c4. Rook d1 to c1, check. King c4 to d3. Rook c1 to b1. Bishop b7 to g2. Rook b1 to a1. King d3 to c4. Rook a1 to b1. Bishop g2 to f3. Rook b1 to a1. Bishop f3 to e2. Rook a1 to b1. Bishop e2 to f3. Rook b1 to a1. Bishop f3 to e2. Rook a1 to a4, check. King c4 to c3. Rook a4 to a3, check. King c3 to c4. Rook a3 to a2. Bishop e2 to d1. Rook a2 to h2. King c4 to c3. Rook h2 to h1. Bishop d1 to b3. King e5 to e4. Bishop b3 to c2, check. King e4 to d5. Bishop c2 to g6. Rook h1 to g1. Bishop g6 to h7. Rook g1 to g3, check. Bishop h7 to d3. Rook g3 to f3. King c3 to c2. King d5 to d4. Bishop d3 to b5. Rook f3 to f2, check. King c2 to b3. Rook f2 to f3, check. King b3 to c2. Rook f3 to f2, check. King c2 to b3. Rook f2 to f4. King b3 to b2. Rook f4 to f8. Bishop b5 to a4. King d4 to c4. Bishop a4 to b3, check. King c4 to b4. Bishop b3 to e6. Rook f8 to f2, check. King b2 to c1. King b4 to c3. King c1 to d1. King c3 to d4. King d1 to e1. King d4 to a3. King e1 to d1. Rook f2 to d2, check. King d1 to c1. King e3 to d3. Bishop e6 to d7. King d3 to c3. Bishop d7 to c6. Rook d2 to d6. Bishop c6 to b7. Rook d6 to d7. Bishop b7 to c6. Rook d7 to c7. Bishop c6 to a4. Rook c7 to a7. Bishop a4 to c2. Rook a7 to a2. Bishop c2 to f5. Rook a2 to a1, check. Bishop f5 to b1. King c3 to b3. King c1 to d2. Rook a1 takes b1. King d2 to d3. Rook b1 to d1, check. King d3 to e4. King b3 to c4. King e4 to e5. Rook d1 to d5, check. King e5 to e4. Rook d5 to b5. King e4 to e3. Rook b5 to a5, check. King e3 to f3. King c4 to d3. King f3 to f4. Rook e5 to b5. King f4 to f3. Rook b5 to b4. King f3 to f2. Rook b4 to f4, check. King f2 to g2. King d3 to e2. King g2 to g3. King e2 to e3. King g3 to g2. Rook f4 to g4, check. King g2 to h3. King e3 to f3. King h3 to h2. Rook g4 to h4, check. King h2 to g1. Rook h4 to h7. King g1 to f1. Rook h7 to h1, checkmate.